As per the worldview of English 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the lives of individuals in the state of nature were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, a state in which self-interest and the absence of rights and contracts prevented the social, namely social order or civility. Hobbes believed natural condition of mankind is what would exist if there were no government, no civilization, no laws, and no common power to restrain human nature. Hobbes defines contract as the mutual transferring of right. In the Hobbesian view of the state of nature, everyone has the right to everything. There are no limits to the right of natural liberty. The term Hobbesian nightmare is therefore used to describe a chaotic society riddled with brutality, where social strata are constantly engrossed in self-centered perpetual aggression and conflict that constantly escalates to widespread violence in which the state fails to enforce law and order to restore balance. Therefore, because Hobbes viewed the state of nature as a brutal and horrific war of all against all, resulting in a Darwinian survival of the fittest type scenario, Hobbes advocated for a strong state to strictly enforce law and order and maintain social stability with contracts. Hobbes promoted that monarchy is the best form of government and the only one that could guarantee peace. Hobbes argued that placing all power in the hands of a king would mean more resolute and consistent exercise of political authority. In opposition to Hobbes is the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the 19th century Russian author Leo Tolstoy, who both appeal to emotion when they glorify nature and promote a subjectively utopian ideal of all that is primitive. They condemn civilization and preach a return to nature or their subjective view of the state of nature. As such, a notable idea from Rousseau, which has been mentioned in previous videos, was the concept of the noble savage against civilization. Essentially, Rousseau asserted that man is inherently good by nature, or uncorrupted, and that it is society and civilization which corrupts him. As per Rousseau's concept, primitive man was a carefree and wholly admirable living being in righteous harmony with others until corrupted by the limits and depravities of civilization. It almost goes without saying then that Rousseau was a staunch believer in a sense of natural equality, maintaining that if men would again be happy, happiness being subjective, free and equal, life would be easy or apparently easy. All one would have to do is simply demolish the fabric of civilization, abolish private property, and return to nature. Of course, there is an element of truth in Rousseau's fantasy, as is the case with many false doctrines, since if they were entirely ridiculous, no one would ever want to convert to or look to espouse them in a serious manner, and thus they could never materialize as a potential danger to society. To Rousseau's credit, he praised the beauty of nature and humble living. This was especially refreshing in the 18th century, as it seemed juxtaposed to the apparent pompous and artificial high society of that epoch. Just as a jaded man can escape the metropolis, venture out into the wilderness, and later return refreshed and invigorated from his adventure. However, the effect of Rousseau's work didn't necessarily inspire just a healthy love for minimalism, nature, and exercise, but subsequently promoted a hatred for civilization. To use the prior example, it would be as if the hypothetical miserable man should return from his time in the wilderness and immediately decide to burn his house down to live the rest of his life as a wild man in nature. Highly drastic and questionable behavior indeed. Sure, a return to nature as a temporary measure is excellent advice to clear the mind and has numerous benefits. But to return to nature permanently is not exactly necessary, as man is no longer a Neanderthal. Not to mention it is quite possible for an individual to live a simple, minimalist and peaceful life without wishing for the destruction of the modern world. The Amish have practiced aspects of that lifestyle for centuries. Thus, the position one takes on the political spectrum is largely dependent upon whether one views man as inherently good and therefore Rousseauian in their view of man, inclined to be liberal in perspective and thus left-wing, or whether one views man as inherently bad or corrupt and is therefore Hobbesian in their view of man, inclined to be more conservative in perspective or even illiberal in perspective and right-wing. Liberals, communists and anarchists all see man as inherently good or argue that he ought to be good, and thus in their view he is only corrupted by civilization. So the logical conclusion of all three ideologies is virtually identical. Man as a noble savage corrupted by civilization, so civilization must be deconstructed and destroyed to allow man to return or progress to a stateless society and utopian state of nature. However, as Hobbes points out, a state of nature is a brutal survival of the fittest scenario, within which no modern man would survive, and certainly not a liberal-minded modern man. The logical conclusion is the same for the three ideologies, but the speed of progress to utopia is different, and the methods are different. Liberalism is slow and gradual progression to the end goal. Communism is accelerated progression to the end goal. And anarchism is extreme acceleration to the end goal. This is what is rather baffling and nonsensical about the politics of minorities, such as the notion of the disabled person being progressive in their worldview. Philosophically, they don't realize what they are progressing towards. And even if they manage to get to the conclusion and the stateless ideal of the state of nature, they especially wouldn't survive and would at least need some form of government assistance to live comfortably. So surely it is essential that disabled people are at the very least classical liberals and advocate for small government and then just do their best to take personal responsibility for most of their life where possible. However, all three ideologies of liberalism, communism and anarchism are flawed because the utopia is nothing more than an ideal. It can't be properly defined or fulfilled because it is not factual. The fact is, reality is harsh. Liberalism was created to soften reality where possible, but it can't be softened entirely, and this is distressing for the typical modern liberal. Now to address a more recent example of someone who is an advocate of the primitive, Leo Tolstoy. Nowadays, we may determine a disdain for civilized life as a morbid and unnecessary rejection of sensible ethos. However, Tolstoy was always adamant in his denouncing of complicated culture and chaotic civilization. His endorsement was of all that is simple, natural, essential, and wild. He was critical of civilization and considered it an enemy of happiness and fulfillment. It is quite clear Tolstoy was influenced by the utopian platitudes of Rousseau's work. Both had very romantic views of what nature is, yet Tolstoy also spoke highly of Schopenhauer, and from this insight he further developed a sense of earnest spirituality. living in reclusive and non-indulgent surrounds. He had a will to simplify, an intrinsic urge to move back toward the life of a primitive man. One of Tolstoy's renowned quotes is, "There is no greatness where there is not simplicity, goodness, and truth." Tolstoy was also heavily influenced by the American transcendentalist movement of the early 19th century. A core principle of the movement was in a belief of the inherent goodness of people and nature, clearly adhering to Rousseauian influence. Advocates believe that society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, and they have faith that people are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. Transcendentalism emphasized subjective intuition over objective empiricism. Adherents believe that individuals can generate completely original insights with little attention and esteem given to the past. One of the most prominent transcendentalists was Henry David Thoreau, who is best known for his book Walden, or Life in the Woods. The book is a reflection upon Thoreau's simple living in a wooden hut within the natural surrounds of Walden Pond from 1845 to 1847. It is considered a personal declaration of independence, a social experiment, a voyage of spiritual discovery, satire, and to some degree, a manual for self-reliance. Simplicity seemed to be the model for Thoreau's life, as he asserts that man ought to maintain, quote, "Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. Instead of 3 meals a day, if it be necessary, eat but 1. Instead of 100 dishes, 5, and reduce other things in proportion." Whilst there is some merit to Thoreau's statements, and his work gained widespread acclaim, it was certainly not without criticism. Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, best known for his works Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, judged Thoreau's living alone and apart from modern society in natural simplicity to be a mark of effeminacy, whilst also deeming him a self-indulgent skulker, implying an evasion of obligation, living in hiding as a hermit or lurking out of cowardice. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the American novelist who was prominent within the dark romantic subgenre along with Edgar Allan Poe, had mixed feelings on Thoreau. In 1842, Hawthorne seemed to admire Thoreau's words, calling him a keen and delicate observer of nature, a genuine observer which I suspect is almost as rare a character as even an original poet, and nature in return for his love seems to adopt him as her especial child and shows him her secrets which few others are allowed to witness. Yet Hawthorne also mentioned he thought Thoreau, quote, "repudiated all regular modes of getting a living and seems inclined to lead a sort of Indian life amongst civilized men." The poet, abolitionist, and devout Christian John Greenleaf Whittier, who was part of the Quaker or Friends Society, detested the message of Walden, deeming it wicked and heathenish. He claimed that Thoreau wanted man to lower himself to the level of a woodchuck and walk on 4 legs. Yet in regards to Tolstoy, perhaps one of the most objectionable of all his positions is that nature is to him the pure and simple, thus implying that civilization and culture is impure. To return to nature would be to promote the expulsion, simplification, and likely destruction of culture, advocacy of the leveling out of civilization, as if society were represented by stones with no stone placed above another. It stands to reason then that the Soviets planted him at the top of their literary pantheon, largely because of the radical philosophy he preached amid the early rumblings of the October Revolution of 1917. The publication of War and Peace and Anna Karenina made Tolstoy so famous that one contemporary described him as Russia's second Tsar. He used that position to rail against the church, as well as the police, the army, meat eating, private property, and all forms of violence. Vladimir Lenin loved Tolstoy's pent-up hatred. He even called him the mirror of the Russian Revolution, ignoring his pacifism and religiosity. Tolstoy was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church and has been accused of helping to speed up the rise of the Bolsheviks. In politics, the far right is only ever reactionary in nature, and thus only ever gains greater support when the left is perceived to have gone too far, and the only way to rein in the chaos is to look to strict order. Ideally, you would want to have a steady, moderate situation where there are checks and balances to the left's constant desire for progress toward utopia. But now, even the more moderate population tend to lean to the left. We know for a fact that the left will not stop with the progress, and someone like clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson knows it too. That is why he has gone on record and predicted a hard pushback. He has been trying to warn the left that what they are doing will cause a major backlash. If you wanted to be radical or edgy, you could argue it's totally justified and serves them right for being so outrageous in the first place. But either way, it won't be pretty. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. In many ways, it is the left's own fault that the right ever manages to gain traction, but they are often too arrogant and ignorant to see it.